manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. So, last week we saw the beginning of this narrative really beginning to develop as Jesus begins to call his disciples. We've been looking at that for the last couple of weeks, matter of fact. Last week, if you remember specifically, it centered around this one disciple named Nathanael. Now, Nathanael was the one that Philip went and got. He went and told him, hey, Nathanael, you've got to come and see the one who is the Christ. We have found him. We have found the Messiah. He is Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. To which Nathanael responded, can anything good come from Nazareth? And we talked about the competition between where Nathanael was from and also where Jesus was from, Nazareth. And so this whole thing develops where he goes, man, you just got to come and see. Come and see for yourself. So he invites him, and Nathanael, for whatever reason, he must have been intrigued by this or motivated by Philip's invitation. So he goes and he meets Jesus. And as he's approaching, Jesus says something to him. He says, look here, there is an Israelite of Israelites here. An Israelite in whom there is no guile. There is no deceit. There is no swindling. And one thing Neil pointed out, in essence, what he was saying, here is an Israelite in whom there is no Jacob. Because Jacob was known as a swindler. That's actually what his name means, is heel grabber or swindler. Jacob's whole life was centered around, believing that God had promised him something, but swindling and manipulating other people to get it. And that's what he did with his brother. And of course, there were consequences throughout his life until he finally wrestles with God and realizes God is the one who's really in control here, not me. And his name is changed to Israel from Jacob, and Israel means one who contends or wrestles with God. Okay, so when you think about that whole story developing there, it actually makes sense that he segues into this because he starts off here talking about the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. The reason I say that this fits with the last narrative, if you remember, Nathanael the skeptic comes to him. He says these couple of things. Nathanael says, how do you even know who I am? He said, I saw you when you were under the fig tree. For whatever reason, we don't know. The text doesn't tell us exactly why that hit a chord with Nathanael, but it does. And he says, you are the Christ. You are the Son of God. And Jesus says, you believe just because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree? Greater things than this you will see. You will see heaven open and angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So we talked about last week that there is this picture between what Nathanael was hoping and expecting and what Jesus begins to do. He says to him, you're going to see greater things than these. It makes sense now that John takes us to an explanation of the greater things than just knowing what you were doing under the fig tree, what you were thinking, what you were meditating on, and being able to speak that and be able to see these things happen. And so that's the power of what happens here. Greater things than this is exactly what's going to happen there. Now there's another connection here. John chapter 1 verse 51, and he said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. That again goes back to Jacob. And Jacob had this vision of this ladder where angels were ascending and descending on that ladder from heaven to earth. Well, Jesus changes that vision a little bit. It says, not that you will see angels ascending and descending on a ladder, but you'll see them ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So, in other words, Jesus is going to be the connection between heaven and earth. We see earth and heaven meet together because of the person of Jesus. He is the one who always has been, and he is now the Word that has become flesh. There's a connection now between heaven and earth because of Jesus. Now, it only makes sense now that John would begin to show us exactly what that statement means. What does it mean when heaven comes to earth? And so he thought the best example I could start with is the first miracle that happens in the ministry of Jesus. And that's where he starts us in verse 1. Let's look at verse 1 and 2. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. Now, I will say this. A lot of commentators believe that somehow Mary was in charge of this wedding, or she was instructing in it. I don't believe that simply because of the way the text unfolds. It says that the mother of Jesus was there, and Jesus also was invited. So that would make me think that Mary was invited to come to this wedding. Not that she was in charge of it. She was invited, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to that. And so I think that lets us know a little bit about the drama that's unfolding there. And I'll get to that in just a second. He starts off, though, talking about the third day. Now, again, John depicts for us 7 days in the first chapter there, and then we get to the 7th day here at the beginning of chapter 2. So for 7 days, he's told us exactly what is going on there. And I think that relates back to creation. Again, think about the similarities and parallels between the opening of John and the opening of the book of Genesis. And there's these obvious parallels that John is drawing to say there is this new creation. There is this new opportunity to walk with God like we saw in the garden. So he's obviously drawing our attention to those things. Now, more than likely, Jesus finds himself here not because of his mother, but because of Nathanael, his disciple that he's called. John chapter 21, which we'll get there in a few years, but John chapter 21 verse 2 says this: After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way: Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of, what does it say? So now, because of what we see in chapter 21, we know that Nathanael is from Cana of Galilee. Nathanael was the last one that Jesus has this conversation with. Nathanael was blown away because he believed Jesus is the Son of God. What is natural? He's like, you got to come to my hometown. You got to meet my friends. You got to see my family. So more than likely, that's why John carries over into this, because of this experience that Nathanael has. Now Nathanael wants Jesus to come and meet all of his friends. More than likely, Nathanael is actually the connection to their invitation to this. And remember, it's not too far away from where they already were. Now, verse 3 says this: When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, They have no wine. And Jesus said to her, Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Now, first of all, I want to explain why this is such a tragedy. Now, Jewish wedding ceremonies were the highlight of any young Jewish man and woman. I mean, this was really the highlight of your life. This week that you would go through this whole ceremony. After that, it was downhill. I mean, you were married and there was nothing else to look forward to. I'm kidding. But it really was, because in this whole cultural mindset, the wedding was not something like we do today. Today, you get a wedding invitation, you go, you sit through maybe a 20-minute, maybe 30, if I'm doing it, 45-minute presentation. If you're going to a Catholic wedding, you're there all day long. I'm just kidding. But, you've been to those that are a lot longer, but most of the time, it's about 30 minutes long, the ceremony. Then you go and sit down and you eat. If it's an evening meal, maybe you have a whole meal. Maybe sometimes if it's a very uppity wedding, you sit down and have dinner at a table. But most of the time, it's kind of an opened up place. You walk through there, you eat some things, you talk to some people, and you wish the bride and the groom well, and you go home. Not so in Jewish culture. It actually lasted for a week or longer. And it was actually all day and night. And people would just come freely. They would sleep overnight if they wanted to. Everybody was welcome to come. And literally, whenever the wedding began, they would begin with the groom going to the bride's house and receiving her. They would announce the groom's arrival with trumpets and let them know, here comes the groom. And so the bride would get ready, and she would go and meet him at the property line. And then they would be escorted through the longest route possible back to the father of the groom's house where the wedding ceremony would take place. And the reason they did that was so that so many people could wish them well on the process of that parade route, for lack of a better term. And so everybody was coming out saying, congratulations. Then they would literally be given a crown to wear, a robe to wear, and they would be treated like kings and queens for the entire time during this reception. Doesn't that sound awesome? We should do some of that again. So the fathers of daughters are like, no, we should not do anything like that. But that was it. Now, here's the thing. Wine was a representation of joy. Matter of fact, the Jewish rabbis had this saying, and they would say it often: where there is no wine, there is no joy. I'm not going to ask for it, but I bet a few of you would say amen to that. Okay? So here's their saying. the wine represented joy and a joyous celebration. And a joyous celebration was celebrated with the presence of wine. If you ran out of wine, it was this shame that would come upon you. If you were to have this wedding ceremony and you were to run out of wine, you would be talked about in the community. It would be this badge of scorn that you would wear from that day forward. It would ruin what would be the most festive time in your entire life. That is the scenario that's being set up here. So when she comes to Jesus, I don't think she's even in charge here. She's coming up and she is embarrassed for them. She doesn't want this to happen for this young bride and groom. She probably knows them. And she's going up and she's saying, Jesus, they don't have any more wine. They're about to run out. There's not going to be enough to last through this ceremony. So she is obviously very, very concerned with what's going on in this celebration. Jesus responds with a very odd response, doesn't he? He says, woman, what does this have to do with me? Now, I understand that this is in the scripture, but I want to caution any children or teenagers or even older ones that if your mother asks you to do something, your response should never be, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. I mean, if you even go to the King James Version, it says, woman, what does this have to do with me? Woman, what do I have to do with this whole situation? Now, that sounds a little bit harsh, doesn't it? Now, Jesus, this is Mary. This is your mother. She is coming concerned for this young couple that's getting married, and you say, woman, what have I to do with thee? Now, here's the thing. The term woman was a term of endearment in that time. If I were to remind you, remember when Jesus finds the woman who is caught in adultery, and the religious leaders were using her to try and pin Jesus in a corner? And Jesus says to her, woman, where are your accusers? And she says, there are none, they've gone. And he says, neither do I accuse you or condemn you. Go and sin no more. Is there any kind of feeling of resentment or harshness in that? No, not at all. I mean, there's a feeling of compassion and grace in that. Actually, oftentimes, Jesus uses the term woman as a term of endearment. Remember when he was on the cross and he knew he was about to die. And so John, the gospel writer, and his mother were standing there at the foot of the cross. And he says, woman, behold thy son. Son, behold thy mother. And he was taking care of his mother, knowing that he was about to die and everything was about to change, and he was giving her care over to John. In that moment, there is no sense of harshness, but a sense of endearment. And so that's the same thing that we understand here. He was not being harsh. He was reminding her of something. He was reminding her that his ministry is taking him in a different direction. He was reminding her of what she knew about him, because that's the whole reason she comes to him in this wedding ceremony. She knows there's something different about him. She knows something that maybe we haven't even been told here because we don't know about his teenage years. But Mary knows something, that when there is a problem, go to Jesus. And so even after he says, my hour has not yet come, which again, you can go ahead and mark and highlight that, because that's a term you're going to hear a lot. Over and over again, Jesus is going to say, my hour is not yet come, my hour is not yet come, my hour is not yet come. And then when it gets time for him to be crucified, in other words, he was going to be turned over, he's going to be betrayed by Judas, he says, my hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. So his hour doesn't come at a Jewish wedding feast. His hour doesn't come in any of the other miracles. The greatest miracle is saved for the very end. And that miracle is how God redeems his people through the blood of Jesus. I want to remind you that this first miracle is about water turning into wine, about something simple turning into something joyous. Yet Jesus reminds them, hey, if you're impressed with this, greater things you will see. The best is saved to last. Do you see this even in this ceremony? When do they have the best wine? It's at the end. So you see all of these pictures that are developing in here. Now, his mother says in verse 5, do whatever he tells you. She's speaking to the servants there. Do whatever he tells you. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I just want to remind you, man, that's great advice. Okay? You can't give any better advice than that. Do whatever he tells you. And I would tell you in your life situations, whatever's going on, whatever crisis you may find, do whatever he tells you. Now, you're wondering what to do in that relationship, do whatever he tells you. You're wondering how to handle that business deal, do whatever he tells you. And the way that we know what he tells us to do is, number one, through his word, number two, through his spirit, number three, through other brothers and sisters that we get counsel through. And God uses all of them. I don't say 1, 2, and 3 as a priority. I'm saying 1, 2, and 3 as they work all together the way God uses to reveal his will and his plan for us. So when God reveals something to us, we should do whatever he tells us to do. Look at verse 6. Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim, and he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. Now let's look at this a little bit by bit. Starts off telling us that there were these 6 stone water jars that were there for the Jewish rites of purification. Now again, remember, John never wastes any ink in his pen. If he writes something down and he gives you detailed information, there's a reason that he's giving you that information. Or else he would save his ink and he would just continue past that, because that's not a big part of what he's trying to say. John never wastes ink. Okay? So we have to pay attention to this. What is it about the Jewish rites of purification that are speaking into this? Well, the water jars that he's referring to here are used for that purification process. If you go back to the book of Leviticus, there are several times whenever you are to wash your hands, another to wash your face before you ever eat or drink. There is all this ceremonial washing. Matter of fact, it's important to understand that's why Jesus was baptized early in his ministry. Why? Well, when you go back to Leviticus, you find before a high priest could ever go into the Holy of Holies with the blood sacrifice, there was a bronze laver on the outside. He had to first wash himself completely before he would ever go in on behalf of Israel. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, before he ever steps into that priestly role, what does he do? He washes himself ceremonially, just like the law would ask for. So there's a lot of this symbolism that you see as you move through here. And again, John points out that there were these stone pots that were used to fulfill the law, that were used in the rites of purification to make people okay or acceptable to carry on with eating or drinking or even feasting in this matter. So when we think about what that represents, those rites of purification represent the law. They represent the old law in a sense of what Jesus is initiating here. Not that the old law is gone and we don't have to worry about it anymore. I'm talking about the old covenant, the way that we are made right. So the old way that we are made right was perfection, or since we can't meet perfection, then we have to go through these rites of purification to make us okay or acceptable to receive the grace of God and to be made right with God. So this Jewish system was a way of bringing purification to Israel, and in essence, really the whole world. And Jesus, I think through this story, is saying that there's a new way of making people right that's being brought into the narrative. There's a subtle message here. The old system ultimately doesn't leave us with any personal joy. Remember, wine represents what? Joy. Yes, where there is no wine, there is no joy. So the old system leaves us with nothing but water. And Jesus is going to bring joy in through this new system. Watch how this develops. He says to them, fill the jars with water. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment, because what would you do in that situation if you're the servant? Okay, I want you to get into this situation for a moment. You're sitting there, okay, you're a servant. You've heard the mother of Jesus walk over and say, Jesus, they're out of wine. They don't have any more wine. And Jesus says, woman, what am I to do? The hour has not yet come. You're kind of confused by that, but well. And then Jesus' mother comes over to you and says, hey, whatever he tells you,